So good to be here. Good to be with everybody. I love ARC, love what they represent. Connection, which we all need. I think especially in a season at a time like this, where we've been somewhat isolated and disconnected. Connection is something that I think we all really gain from. Thank you. And so it's great to see everybody. My wife is also preaching. She's speaking. She's over at Sea Point at Life Church over there. So you guys lucked out. You got me, because that's where the real fire will be. But look, it's an honor to be here and to speak to all of you. And yeah, special shout out to Mark and Jan. Phenomenal people. I think anyone who knows these guys loves them, and what they've been doing over many years. It's an absolute testimony to great leadership, God's faithfulness, and to see Mark in the front row, healthy and strong, is just awesome. Praise God for that, because he's been through a few battles, but he just keeps on going. It's awesome. Well, I'm going to speak to you today. Message title is Built to Last. There's a book by Jim Collins called Built to Last, and this is completely different from that, just the same title. But it's really, I was asked to speak kind of about health, about our health, church health, health as leaders. And again, I think that's always important. But I think particularly in a season and time like this, even more so. I want to read two verses to start with. One is Proverbs 4:23. You're probably familiar with both of these. Guard your heart above all else, for it determines the course of your life. That's in the New Living Translation. I think NIV says, guard your heart with everything, or words to that effect, because out of it flow all the issues of life. That determines the course of your life, or the issues of your life flow out. And it's reminding us that it's what's inside that determines, what's happening outside, outwardly. And it's a principle for us, I think, to remind ourselves of. Jesus also speaks about this in Matthew 12:33. Jesus says, make a tree good and its fruit will be good. Make a tree bad and its fruit will be bad, for a tree is recognized by its fruit. And we see this theme over and over in Scripture, that it's the internal stuff that really does matter. If we get it right, internally, the benefits are extraordinary. Whether that be the internal function and culture and attitude and spirit of our team, whether it be our own, internal spirit and what's going on inside of us. If we get it right, it has extraordinary benefits, but if we get it wrong and we neglect the internal and focus just on the external, it can have serious consequences. We live in a world that is really focused on the external, isn't it? It's interesting that, really the only one person we know internally is ourselves. Even in our relationships with our significant others, we can't always know what's going on in our marriage partner, in our key team, in our kids. We can gauge it based on external things. But really, it's what's inside of us personally that we can know, and where we can really, I suppose, ask ourselves important questions and then hopefully build relationally in a way with others that also gives them the opportunity to be honest, to share what is going on inside of them and to help each other to deal with those internal battles, struggles, issues, whatever you want to call it, that we all have. Three tensions I just want to talk about as we get started here, and then we're going to consider some elements from David and Saul, the first two kings of Israel. But three tensions that kind of relate to the internal and the external. The first one is ego versus vision. It's great to have vision and be led by it. It's not so great to have ego and be led by it. The reality is that in any form of leadership, there is a tension where sometimes, if you're not careful, your ego is driving you in a certain direction when it should be your leadership based on vision that is driving you. Ego tends to focus on the external. Ego's about, how do I look? How do we look? Do I represent well? Are people going to value who I am by what they see? Whereas vision is more focused on an internal drive of what God has specifically given you. Your church, you as a leader, and it focuses on a specific, picture, story of what God's calling you to. It's not focused on what others are doing. See, ego tends to look where everyone else is and what others are doing and kind of comparing and going, am I good enough? Are we doing okay? Whereas an internal vision that flows out isn't worried about what other people are doing. There are great people doing great things and I want to celebrate them. And when I have a internal vision that God's called us to, that's what we focus on. And we're not worried about what everyone else is doing. But there's a tension there because ego is about proving my worth and proving my value and wanting to make sure, it's acceptable. Whereas vision is about building something of value. Ego is about proving I'm valuable. Vision is about building something of value. And so there's a tension there. And we just, we need to be mindful of that at all different seasons of our leadership, just looking at how do I keep my ego in check and make sure what I'm doing isn't just about trying to prove my worth or value, but I'm continuing to go, no, God, what have you called us to? And I'm going to give you an example of that a little bit later because I can see what someone else is doing and think, man, we should be doing that, but it's actually not aligned with our vision. But it's because I want to do that, and I feel like if we do it, people are going to celebrate me and value us, but it could be ego-based. And so I've got to navigate this tension with regard to what's going on inside of me. The second one is building relationships versus doing a task. I think this is something we've all kind of felt the effect of in this COVID season. I think it's slowed us all down, which isn't a bad thing. And I think we've then started to question, how are we going about the ministry that we're called to? Are we focused on building relationships, or are we committed more to just getting the task done? Because our short-term thinking is, well, we've just got to get this done and it's got to happen. But we can do that in such a way that we mess people up. Rather than going, no, we want to do this, we want to do it well, but we want to make sure there's long-term sustainable relationships that are going on here. And if you look at it in relation, I know Donovan in the last session spoke about money. It's interesting because our world values money and uses people. You think about it. The way of this world, the culture of this world is money is of immense value, and we will use people. I'm not saying you or I will, but this is kind of the way the world works. I will use people to get money. Whereas Jesus actually operated the opposite way, which was, no, we value people and we use money. We use money to reach people rather than using people to get money. And I think those tensions are one that we have to consider. Am I doing things to achieve the task, and yet we got the task done, and some of us are more task-focused people, and that's fine. But along the way, we've got to ensure that the way we get tasks done isn't destroying relationships with people. And on the other side of it, it isn't just about building relationships with people, but nothing ever gets done. Because at some point, we do have to challenge where people are at in order to continue to make progress. So there are these tensions there that we're dealing with, and those tensions often are affected by how we're going on the inside. Again, if you lead back to ego versus vision, if I'm building from a place of internal vision, then I relate to people differently. But if I'm leading from a place of ego, wanting to prove something, then often what happens is I'm, using people, and it will come across. And thirdly, just another tension here with regard to what's going on inside of us is immediate results versus sustainable growth. Immediate results versus sustainable growth. I think, we all want immediate growth, don't we? Immediate results. We all want every year our, offering, if you do a half of the house or a miracle offering or something, every year you want it to grow, don't you? Every year you want the attendance numbers to look better than they were the year before. But guess what? Sometimes they're not. I think in COVID, we've all felt the effect. Our income, I think, overall is probably down about 25%. We've had to manage our expenses in order to make sure we can continue to, pay salaries and do those kind of things. And the interesting thing, isn't it, is your income drops, but the salaries don't, unless you fire everybody. So you have these tensions, don't you? You're like, well, we need immediate results, but immediate results can backfire and create this false economy that doesn't allow for real, genuine, sustainable growth. And there's stories of this, whether it be in the church world, whether it be in companies. General Electric was an amazing company, and if you study them, you'll see that for many years they continued to grow. But actually, as you looked under the surface, what was happening is they were finding ways to look like the results would show shareholders and everyone else what needed to be seen. But internally, it wasn't really functioning like that. No one was actually prepared to ask the hard questions or deal with the difficult issues. And so at one point, they could no longer sustain the growth because it was false. They were kind of finding ways to manipulate things to look like, hey, we're still doing great, but no one was being honest about some real issues. And over time, the growth was gone, and they had real sustainable problems rather than sustainable growth. And so I think these are tensions. I love results. I love to see us growing. I think anyone who's in church leadership ministry loves to hear the stories of things, if you've got any kind of visionary in you, that you're making progress. But sometimes I have to pull back from that and go, hang on, is this going to be sustainable? How do we continue to develop sustainable growth? And maybe that means the growth is a bit slower. Maybe that means saying no to some things. Maybe that means changing some elements of how we do what we do, because long term, we want to keep a sustainable growth. And immediate results, as wonderful as they are, can sometimes be short-sighted. So just a few tensions that I think, I love immediate results. I love big events. I love conferences. But I've actually never seen any of those things in and of themselves grow a ministry. It doesn't mean we don't do conferences. It doesn't mean we don't do events. But those aren't the only things that build sustainability, sustainable growth over time. And so, looking at that internally and going, okay, managing these tensions, I think, is important when it comes to our health, the health of our church. So, all right, what I want us to do now is consider the way organizations operate. In fact, actually, can I use that whiteboard over there? I read a book which fascinated me. It's called Barbarians to Bureaucrats. I don't know if anyone's heard of the book. It's by a guy named Lawrence Miller, I believe. And he did the work. His work was based on the work by a guy named Arno Toynbee, who studied civilizations. And he looked at why civilizations rise and fall, why they go into decline. And Lawrence Miller took that research and then built it around various organizations and looked at, well, why does an organization succeed and then for a point it's doing really well, and then it seems to decline. That what happens for a lot of organizations is, they go through this growth phase, and then if they're not careful, they tend to plateau, and then they start to decline. And you see it in obviously in civilizations over the years of history, but you also see it in organizations. And he talked about how there's different stages. And let me just give you a little bit of a quick tour around this. The first phase is what he calls the visionary prophets. Okay, so these are the people who they kind of see stuff that others don't see. They're like, we're going to do this, and they're prophetic, and they, you look at some of these people and the way they speak, and you think they are crazy, but they have a determined craziness, and they just absolutely go for it, and they'll tell you what they're going to do, and you think there is no way, but they see it, and they've got this prophetic edge to them, and they achieve it. And it's amazing. The thing is that at some point, for it to be sustainable, you have to go from visionary prophets. So they will carve out the ground. They'll establish something that was never there. They'll speak it out. People will rally around them. But at some point, you have to go from that to what is referred to as the builders or the pioneers. Okay, so visionaries are fantastic. Visionary prophets are fantastic. But you need, if it's going to be sustainable, you need builder pioneers. You need people who can establish structure, who can kind of pull everyone together and look at, okay, how do we just go from, guys, we're going for it, to actually a sustainable reality to, the momentum of what's going on. So you need these different, and some of us are looking at this going, I kind of see where I am, or you're seeing others and you're thinking about them and where they fit. The third area, which is the one where things can start to become troublesome, is the bureaucrats. Okay, I'm not sure if I'm spelling this correctly, but that will do for now. Spell it, it's in Afrikaans. So what happens in an organization, at some point you go from the builder pioneers, if you're not careful, you go to the bureaucrats. Okay, the bureaucrats are the ones who love systems. Like, love it so much that it becomes annoying. And we know that. We've all been to home affairs. And what happens is that systems become the priority over vision, over growth, over everything. And the bureaucrats start to control the environment. And this pretty much happens in any organization, because at some point you can't sustain always the visionary prophet mentality. It's just overwhelming. Okay? But you need them. You need builders, pioneers, and you actually need good people to create systems in order for things to flow. But if you're not careful, when decline starts to happen is when these people start to take control. And what then happens is your visionary pioneers go somewhere else. They'll find another way because they are visionary pioneers, and they are not going to work in a system that is overwhelmed by bureaucrats. The worst place you end up at is with the aristocrats. The aristocrats do nothing except suck the life out of the organization. The aristocrats basically are in a position where everything has been built, people have done all the hard work, it's all been set up, there is cash coming in, and they just milk the system. They are not visionary, they are not pioneers, they are not building, they are not establishing anything other than taking everything they can get out of the organization. And when that happens, that's when you're in trouble. That's why civilizations have declined. That's why organizations have declined, because the aristocrats took over and lived for themselves, got everything out for them, and no longer saw value in building, in developing, in establishing. And we see this in denominations, if I'm honest, if we want to talk about the church. The church is not immune to this. We've seen this happen over time. And what happens? Visionary, pioneer, builders leave. They go somewhere else. Because they don't want it. They can't be in this. It's going to stifle them. And so you see these pockets of growth happen in random places because visionary prophets and builders, the like, will always find a way to do that. Sadly, some of them who should be in the church leave the church and go and do it in business and other places because they were getting too stifled in the environment they were in. So it's interesting to look at something like this and just be aware. Be aware that none of us are immune from this kind of thing, and work again within an understanding that these tensions exist, and we need to be careful that we don't fall into the trap of becoming like this, because this is when we start to decline. So in considering that, in the time that I have, I want us to contrast the difference, and some of it we see in the story of Saul and his kingdom and David and his kingdom. I'm not going to go through all the various verses and passages. You can look it up for yourself. I think we're all familiar with the style of leader that Saul was, as opposed to the style of leader that David was. In broad terms, if you think about it, Saul's kingdom was taken from him. How sad. Saul, the first king of Israel, and what happens if you put it in a nutshell, his kingdom was taken from him. David's kingdom lasts, in fact, all the way through to Jesus. Isn't that an amazing thought? That one king, the first king who had all the opportunity in the world, in fact, seemed to be a more outwardly, developed leader, or have the qualities of leadership anyway, and his kingdom's taken from him. David, who when Samuel goes to anoint the new king is not even considered, ends up establishing a kingdom that lasts way beyond him, establishes a legacy that goes all the way through to Jesus. If we look at the contrast of the two, Saul was strong, tall, good-looking, but flawed. His major flaw was insecurity. He was ruled by his ego. David, also it appears that he was strong, that he was good-looking, possibly could be a redhead, Gabe. There is biblical truth to suggest that. And as I've regularly said, Gabe is my favorite ginger. Gabe there, Ed Sheeran, below Gabe. David is good looking, but also flawed. Okay, he's flawed, as we all are. Even David, who is the example here, is not a perfect example. Okay, there's no perfect leader, but there are things that we can deal with if we're more honest. David is a more self-aware leader. He focuses more on the internal of his life, even when he gets it wrong. Saul is constantly focused on the external, or how people see him, on is he valuable enough? Are they, do they honor him the way he deserves to be honored? Whereas David is more focused on the internal. So Saul, what does Saul love? Saul loves himself, let's be honest, and Saul loves power. He loves the throne. David, what does David love? Well, David loves God. Keeps it pretty simple. David loves God. David loves people. Sadly, David also loves women. Let's not focus on... We all have our flaws. So David loves God and David loves people. That's really, a truth there for us to consider. Okay, so 3 questions I want us to ask in the few moments that I have with you guys. Number 1, what do you love? Saul loved the throne, he loved the power, he loved the position, He loved the prominence. God has a way of humbling all of us when we love the wrong things. I remember one time, I don't know if I've told you guys this story of being a youth pastor at our Hillsong Church in Sydney, and we were about to build our first building, and I was invited to a meeting with Pastor Brian and the architect, and I think our general manager at the time, my wife was, Lucinda was with me, and I was pumped. I was like, man, I'm going to meet the architect. We're going to talk about the youth needs for this new building. First time we've never had a building. 14 years we never had a building, rented facilities. And I remember going in there, you know, and there was a glass coffee table, the architect's there, Pastor Brian's there, our general manager's there, I'm there with my wife, and they have this set of drawings there, and, start talking a little bit about it, and Pastor Brian says something funny. You know, when you're the youth pastor, if your senior pastor says something funny, you're going to laugh. That's right, Gabe. It's the funniest thing. The truth comes out right now, doesn't it, Gabe? It's the funniest thing you've ever heard. This was a time before we wore masks, and as I laughed, something flew out of my nose. And it was almost like it was in slow motion, you know? As it came out, I could, see it, and I'm like, no. And it came out and it lands on the glass coffee table. And I'm looking down at Exhibit A, and I'm looking up at Brian, at the architect, and I'm thinking, they haven't seen it. Because if Pastor Brian saw something like this, he's not going to ignore it. He's going to, oh, you idiot, what have you done? Get rid of that in Jesus' name. And so no one's seen it. So I'm like, okay, I've got to do something about it. So I quickly, but kind of quietly, reach across to the glass coffee table, and in my right hand kind of give a sweeping motion to remove Exhibit A, the booger. It's now in my hand. And I don't care about the meeting anymore. I'm like just trying to, how am I going to get rid of this thing? You know, it's there. I'm like, just whatever they're saying, I'm just agreeing. I don't get, yeah, great. Let's, I just got to get out of there. And, I'm no longer the guy who's full of how we should do this. I'm like not that guy. I'm just like the guy with a booger in his hand who wants to get out of the room. And the meeting finishes, and of course, the architect stands up and says, really nice to meet you, Phil. Sticks out his hand. Gabe, come up here. Let's just demonstrate what happens. So the architect stands up, reaches out his hand, and I just go like that. Lovely to meet you. And I walk out of the room, and he's like looking like, what's wrong with that guy? Like, who gives a handshake? That's not a handshake. I get out of the room, and I'm like, oh my goodness. And Lucinda's like, what was wrong with you in that meeting? You didn't say anything. I'm like, I know. I had a booger in my hand. The architect always looked at me funny after that. I don't think he ever shook my hand again. The reality is, God has a way. That's just a funny example. But God has a way of humbling us, doesn't he? I mean, when we think we're a big deal, God just has a way of reminding us, no, you know what? You're not such a big deal. And that's good. When we love the wrong things, we just get ourselves in all kind of trouble. We think, man, love our own voice. Love our own, idea, love all of that. Now, you want to be confident in these things, but if you love them, it's going to mess things up. We say, if you're on our team, there's 3 things you've got to love. You've got to love South Africa. You've got to love Africa. If you don't love South Africa, you don't love Africa, there's no point being on our team. And, that's just the truth. And we have to consider our hearts about that, because there are challenges in this country. And if you don't, and you no longer love it, and you no longer love the community, you no longer love the place you're called to, it's going to be very hard for you to do good ministry. So you've got to consider that in your heart. Secondly, we say to our team, you've got to love Hillsong. You've got to love, and what I mean by that is you've got to love the way we do church. Okay, so if you love South Africa but you don't love the way Hillsong does church, it's not going to work. If you love Hillsong but you don't love South Africa, it's not going to work. So you need to work out in your heart, what do I love? And then we say, thirdly, you've got to love Phil and Lucinda. We're running this, and if you don't love us, and we're not saying we're perfect, but if you don't have that love, it's not going to work. And I think it's really important that in our teams we consider, well, what are the things that I love? Because if I don't love the right things, then I'm going to mess things up. Saul loved being king more than he loved God. How do we know that? We know it because he kept making decisions that made him look good even when it went against what God wanted. There's an example where Saul ends up, sacrificing, and he's like, we've got to sacrifice now. And the prophet Samuel's like, why did you do that? And he goes, no, we had to do it now. The people need to see me as the king. And it was all messed up. If he was secure, he didn't have to do it. David loved God more than he loved being king, and we see this when he could have killed Saul and become king, but he honored God and wouldn't do it. See, here's a couple of thoughts. When you love God and people, here's what you develop. You develop patience. You get a better perspective. You develop a deeper peace. And you ultimately will make progress in your life, in your ministry. You get more patient, better perspective, peace, and progress. When you love the kingdom, when you love power, when you love that ego controls you, here's what happens. Here's the result. You panic more. You get protective. You become more opinionated. Did you see what I did there? Opinionated. I'm trying to keep them all as P's. And rather than progress, you have more pain. See, progress is always going to have pain attached to it. But when you love the right things, the pain leads to progress. But when you love the wrong things, you see the pain without the progress. All right, so that's the first. And secondly, we'll go through these quickly. What battles do you fight? We all fight battles. The question is, which battles are worth fighting? Saul fought battles. David fought battles. They both fought battles. The sad thing is that many of Saul's battles were about David. They're about being king. Some battles help you build, and other battles cause devastation. Saul was insecure about David, wanted to kill him because he was sure David would take the kingdom. David ended up becoming the king, but Saul could have had a legacy. David battled with his own son because of his mistakes that went back to his sin with Bathsheba. Okay, so David also had some internal battles that were horrible that also came out of his sin and mistakes, relationally. So sadly, if we don't get it right, we end up fighting battles that we wish we didn't have to, and it takes up our energy rather than fighting the battles that matter. Some people seem to be fighting their own battles against the organization. Have you noticed that? There are times when you feel like you've got people on your team and the battles they're having are always with you or always with somebody else and always about what you're doing. And that's not going to work. I understand we have conflict and we challenge and we talk things through, but if you are constantly battling with others on your team about how you do things, it's going to waste so much energy. See, fighting the right battles will build your life and ultimately build the kingdom. Okay, so here's what happens when you build and you fight the right battle. What does it do? It builds credibility. David built credibility when he fought the right battles, didn't he? It builds strength. It's interesting, when David started and he fought the giant Goliath, what did he use? He used a sling. He was given Saul's armor. He goes, I can't use this. But then years later, when he's running from Saul, he goes and hides in a temple and he says, do you have a weapon? Then they bring out Goliath's sword and he goes, yeah, give me that. David has now grown strength. At that point, he's like, I can use this. And this reminds me of the strength that I have. Number 3, it builds resilience. When you fight the right battle, it builds resilience. You can handle more. When you fight the right battles, it builds experience. It's like, oh man, we've been there, know how to handle that. And it builds expertise. So you got to look at what battles am I facing and fighting. Internal battles take up more energy than external ones. When internal battles within an organization take up more energy than the external ones, the organization is heading for trouble. And a side note here, David would not attack or even retaliate against Saul because he was the Lord's anointed. And the same is the church. When we're fighting within and against the church, think about it, that's God's anointed. So we want to be careful about some of those fights. Careful with our conversations, careful with our words, because those words can sometimes lead to battles that we don't need. And that's where maturity comes in. That's where looking at where we're at. If we're healthy, it's amazing how when we're healthy internally, I see things differently. I speak differently. I can find positivity in difficult times. When I'm in a bad place, all I see is the worst case scenario. And I start speaking that out, and it just creates negativity. I get defensive. I get worked up at things I shouldn't get worked up at. And I've got to manage myself, manage my emotions, manage my soul, manage my time. Finally, and we'll finish here, what resources do you have? So 3 questions, and they relate to, I think, how we build. And our resources are different. The resources we have, everyone has different resources, but we've got to learn to be wise with them, particularly in a season like this. And here's where ego can mess up your resources. A number of years ago, we were planning to build a 2,500 seat auditorium on our property at Century City. And we had plans, we had an architect, we went through the whole process. And then we looked at the cost, and I mean, minimum, it's going to cost $150 million to do what we would like to do there. And as we were going through this process, I'm like, you know what? Something in me just doesn't feel right. And I'm looking at this and I'm looking at how much it's going to cost and what the return's going to be as far as how many people we could add into the facility, as opposed to, let's say we took that and, divided it into 10. Not that we had 150 million cash, that'd be nice. But, spent 15 million in 10 locations. We could actually impact more people. And so we presented to, the church, to, kingdom builders, the financial givers, hey, this is the way we're going. Here's drawings. Here's where we're going. And I remember just going, I just don't feel right about this. I remember saying to Lawrence, I just don't think we should go ahead with this. I remember saying to Lucinda, I just don't think we should go ahead with this. And I remember as I did this weight lifted off me. And it was like, no, this is not right for us. And I presented, remember we had our next gathering for all our financial leaders. And I said, guys, just want you to know at this stage, we have plans. We want to improve on our building at Century City, but we are not spending this money. We just don't feel right about it. And everyone actually applauded. Like literally, they never applaud because they're giving money. And they applauded. And I said, it doesn't mean you're off the hook because, we've actually got a vision to reach Africa. And so we're going to need more than the 150 million we were asking you for before. So don't get too, excited there. But what it meant was, I felt it saved us from going down a path that I could have forced, but it would have been an ego decision. It would have been, I want to prove to everyone that we can build a big building because it's going to look good. Our building in Century City is a fantastic building, but if you look at all the development around there, I think I've said it before, they are building some beautiful architecturally designed, stunning buildings, and our building just gets uglier and uglier and uglier. And, it's annoying, but I think I'd rather have, an ugly duckling than a dead goose. And And so we embrace our ugly duckling. But I had to make a decision that was not that was killing my ego. Now, I've got another friend, Rory Dyer. Some of you may know him. And Rory has just built the most stunning building in the east of Pretoria, a 2,000-something seat auditorium. And it is just beautiful. It's possibly the nicest auditorium, church auditorium, in the whole of the country. Okay, and we were there a couple of months ago, went and he's showing us around, and, you know, he's so proud. I think he's got an issue with pride, actually, so pray for him. But this guy, in the middle of COVID, when no one is having church services, has built a 2,000-plus auditorium, but not only has he built it, he's paid for it. Like, people have given. He's been doing church all night, and they already own the land and that. I think they've spent 80-something million, and the money's come in. And it's absolutely annoying and frustrating to have friends like that. But it's also inspiring. And I love it. And I love his vision. I love his faith. I love the fact that he is stirred to do this. Here's the thing. He is following the vision that God has given him, and he's radically committed to that, and he's seeing the results. Now, that's his vision. But the vision God's given us is a different vision. And the vision God's given you is a different vision. And so you've just got to be secure in your vision and go, okay, we have resources. I'm not going to make an ego decision here. I'm going to really hear from God and make a decision that I know aligns with the vision that God has called us to. And can I encourage you, you know how you gain resource? You gain resource by fighting the right battles. How did David gain resource? David started as a shepherd boy. But we know what happened. When he fought Goliath, what did the king offer? The king offered, you know, you're never going to have pay tax, a whole lot of cash, and, you know, the king's daughter. And David thought about no tax, looked at the cash, looked at the king's daughter, and thought 2 out of 3 ain't bad. And that was a joke. Got the king's daughter just thrown in, and didn't that go well? But still never had to pay taxes. So here's the thing. How did he gain resource? He gained resource from fighting the right battles. There are battles that you have to fight. And you need to be healthy to fight those battles. Because as you fight the right battles, you will gain resource. And as you gain the resource, you'll be able to achieve the vision that God has called you to. Amen. God bless. I'm way over time. See you guys soon.